let me begin, and I've got a great presentation for you about identifying Marge. And I've got a number of slides for you. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes.
Great. So to tell the story very quickly, last year, last May, Pacific Rex partnered with the Bong Center and engaged in an incredible expedition that went from Poplar to Papua to search for, locate, and identify the crash site of Richard Bong's most famous airplane, P-38J, nicknamed Marge. In the museum is a P-38 painted in the markings of that very aircraft. That project brought international news and attention to following our expedition and also reporting on our results that we had located and identified this most famous aircraft. Very briefly, I would like to tell you about myself. As I said, my name is Justin Taylan, and I guess you could say I was born into this material. My grandfather served in World War II in the Pacific. He was a combat photographer and soldier in New Guinea, in the Philippines, Australia. And in the early 90s, I took a trip with him back to the places he served. On that trip, we saw war relics, battlefields, traces of war that remained, and I was traveling with my own grandfather, hearing his recollections. And at that moment, I became captivated with this material and decided then and there to devote my life to documenting and sharing information about what remains. That was 30 years ago, in the early 90s. And to this day, I have surveyed personally thousands of aircraft and shipwrecks all across the Asia-Pacific region, including Richard Bong's Marge. And personally, I've been involved with the discovery and reporting of missing in action aircraft from the United States, Japan, and Australia, and being involved in the process of solving a mystery from World War II, bringing remains back to the United States or Japan or Australia that were identified and returned to families. Incredibly fulfilling work and an incredible legacy of the tragedy of war. Pacific Rex is the website and the not-for-profit charity that I started 30 years ago. It has a mission to share information on this topic, search for and locate missing in action personnel, and also advocate for the protection and preservation of these sites and what remains. Every year that goes by, the remains of World War II in the Pacific shrink, both from man-made and natural impacts. And our mission is to preserve and document what remains and share it online and help others to visit these sites if possible. So very briefly, we're going to talk today about what is arguably the most famous aircraft of World War II. And although that's my opinion, I think you'll agree hearing some of the superlatives of this aircraft. First of all, the lifespan of P-38 Marge was a mere 87 days from the day it was finished in the factory till the day it crashed. Less than 90 days, less than 3 months. This plane is significant because it was assigned to Richard Bong, America's ace of ace, and at the time he flew it, he scored 3 of his 40 aerial victories. He also scored a ground victory, and this was the first airplane that Bong adorned with nickname and nose art, and became one of the most famous aircraft worldwide because of the pictures that were taken of it, and of course, the beautiful college portrait of Marge that was placed on the nose. And finally, the plane's life came to an end on March 24th, 1944, piloted by another person, Second Lieutenant Thomas Malone. But because of the pictures and legacy of this aircraft, Marge lived on in newspapers and reporting. Very briefly, Marge's life began in a factory in Burbank, California. And this photo was taken in January 1944. Marge was actually built in December, the very late December 1943. It was one of the first P-38J model aircraft. And the J was a significant version of the P-38 because it was one of the first variants that was completed with a natural aluminum finish at the J-15 model. And it was, at the time, the highest variant that incorporated changes from the earlier models of P-38 that Richard Bong had trained on and flown in his first tour of duty. Every P-38 that was built had unique identifiers, and there were two, actually. One was assigned by the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, and that was called the Lockheed Constructor Number. This was a 4-digit number that was given to every aircraft as it was built by Lockheed. Additionally, there was a U.S. Army Air Force serial number, and this serial number was the U.S. Army's unique identifier for the aircraft. So Marge had two unique numbers, sort of like the VIN number in a car, that made it different and unique from every other P-38 built. So among all the P-38s constructed by Lockheed, there was the J model, one specific model, and then one specific serial number assigned to each plane and constructor number. In addition to Lockheed, there were dozens and dozens of subcontractors that provided parts, components to the aircraft. And this is just a page, one of 5 in the parts catalog, showing you how many other companies provided subassemblies for the aircraft. You can see there General Motors, both Detroit and General Motors, and General Electric in Cleveland, and General Electric in Schenectady, just dozens of companies that also added part numbers and data plates and numbers to the aircraft, making these pieces important but not diagnostic because they were not unique and their numbers and data plates did not necessarily relate to the identity of the aircraft. This card is called the Individual Aircraft Record Card, or IARC. And this was the U.S. Army Air Force's card to list all information about the aircraft Marge. And across the top, I've annotated it here, you can see the model, type, and block, P-38J-15, and the serial number, and a project number, which was a grouping of aircrafts that were sent overseas to a specific place. You'll notice it ends in a -R. That was for replacement aircraft. And below, the card has both typed and handwritten notes. It's a bit hard to read, but it tracks all the locations that this aircraft went in the United States as it was being flight tested and went through modification at Love Field in Texas, and then was flown back to California. And then it was shipped overseas from the port of Oakland to a place called LEFT, L-E-F-T. And LEFT was the code name for the 5th Air Force. And the final lines of this card show that the aircraft was Con AF Miss and Con ACC NC. And those are codes for Condemned Air Force Miscellaneous and Condemned Accident Non-Combat, meaning that this aircraft was lost in a flight that was non-combat, and it also gives the date there, 3/24/44, March 24th, 1944. So after Marge was built, it was shipped overseas on a shipment of aircraft that went aboard a U.S. Navy escort carrier, the USS Fanshawe Bay. And escort carriers were a new innovation, smaller aircraft carrier that were really used to rapidly ship planes from the United States overseas to where they were needed. And in this picture on deck, you can see dozens and dozens of aircraft that were all wrapped in a protective coating and shipped in the open from California across the Pacific to Australia. One of the aircraft in this picture may be Marge. We can't tell because all of them are encased, their serial number isn't visible, but potentially Marge is one of these aircraft on deck. Here's a few more pictures of the P-38s. You can see that every single inch of the flight deck and the hangar deck were loaded with P-38s. And when they arrived in Australia, each aircraft was picked up with a crane and delivered ashore. You'll notice the aircraft are largely intact and assembled. The only parts that were removed were the out of rings of some aircraft. Others were shipped as complete planes. So this was a later in the war when the United States was shipping planes largely complete where they could rapidly be refitted and made airworthy to fly as quickly as possible. Again, one of these pictures may be Marge. In early February, this airplane, which was a brand new J model, was assigned to America's ace of aces, Richard Bong. And at that time, he adorned the plane with his scoreboard of aerial victories, at this point, not 40. And he also gave the plane some personalization. He painted the wingtips, the tail tips, the propeller spinners red. You'll notice in this artwork, a painting by the aviation artist Jack Fellows depicts how Marge looked initially when assigned to Bong. And what's significant, if you look on the nose, is there's no picture of Marge, there's no nickname, because this was the initial markings the plane had. And actually, this was how the plane looked when Bong flew it in combat and scored his 3 aerial victories and ground victory. It was the aircraft, but not yet with nickname and nose art. How do we know all this? Well, Richard Bong, like all pilots, had an individual flight record, a logbook that lists his missions. But tragically, Bong, like many pilots, when he flew, did not write down the serial number of every airplane he flew. He just wrote P-38. So we have to go deeper into research to find out what flights and missions he flew Marge. And using other sources like this excellent book called Stars and Bars by Frank Olnick, it lists the aircraft that Richard Bong scored his aerial victories. And you can see in early 1944, his claims and victories flying Marge. And the serial number was listed in other military documents like combat reports or his recommendations for confirmation from other pilots. Another book by Bong's brother, Carl Bong, has copies of some of those combat reports and recommendations. Here's one of them for his aerial victory on February 15th, where he claimed a Japanese fighter off of Cape Hoskins in New Guinea. And these reports have narrative, and they also have a witness statement of another pilot who observed the victory. In this case, his flight leader and friend, Thomas Lynch. Part of our research involved finding every single picture of Marge. And the greatest collection of Marge photos in the world is there at the Bong Center. And here you can see 27 pictures of this particular P-38 that to date we've been able to identify. And you'll notice in a few of the pictures the serial number is not visible, but we know it's Marge based on the nose art or the sequence that these pictures were taken in. This picture to me is probably the most significant. It's a colorized photo, which was a process during the World War II era where you take a black and white picture and using watercolor paints, paint color onto the picture. And the young man you see there is Corporal Nichols. And this individual is significant in the history of Marge because he is the one that Richard Bong approached and asked to paint nose art on his plane. Nichols had done some other aircraft artwork in New Guinea, and Bong also gave him the wallet-sized picture of Marge that she gave to him when they met or when he departed home during his leave between his first and second tour of duty. And that was a small wallet-sized picture of her college portrait. And Nichols took that picture, enlarged it because he worked in the intelligence section, and had the idea to adhere that picture on the nose of the aircraft. Also, to colorize it, he used this colorizing process of watercolor paint to add some color to her cheeks, highlights to her blonde hair, and then painted the nickname Marge next to it. And all this was done on the machine gun access panel while the plane was being serviced and repaired. And this picture was likely taken on March 10th, 1944, and is probably the first picture of the Marge nickname and nose art applied to the P-38. When people saw this, they were electrified. This was possibly the first airplane in New Guinea, perhaps in all the U.S. Army Air Force worldwide, that had a photo, a realistic photo, adhered to the nose. And people, of course, were attracted to the beautiful woman that was depicted there. Here's a picture of that nose from another angle. And to get into the identification portion here, I've annotated the different markings on this picture that are the unique identifiers. So again, looking at the original picture, you can see highlighted in green are the Army designations, the type designation, technical data block, which was on the left side of the nose. Also, the U.S. Army Air Force serial number, which ended in 993, was painted in large digits on the nose, as well as the Lockheed constructor number that was below it and partially obscured. This picture is highly significant because it's one of the only wide views of Marge, showing the entire aircraft from wingtip to wingtip. And again, with annotations, you can see the green Army Air Force designators, the yellow Lockheed, and the red, which were the custom markings that Richard Bong had applied. The red wingtips, red spinner, and the nickname nose art and scoreboard on the airplane. This is how Marge looked when the plane was lost. And to finish our story, it was not Richard Bong, but another pilot, Thomas Malone, from a night fighter squadron, who flew Marge on actually 2 missions. And we can't forget that although Richard Bong was famous, aircraft in war were military assets that would be flown by any pilot who was qualified whenever needed and available. And Bong's Marge was flown by Malone on 2 occasions, and the second time suffered mechanical failure. He bailed out on March 24th, 1944. How do we know this? Because Malone was active in his association for his night fighter squadron and wrote his recollections, attended reunions, sharing that story, including how Richard Bong was not too happy when he got back because he had lost his beloved Marge. But sadly, Malone died in 2004. He was not available to be interviewed in our project or share in the discovery of a plane that he was at the controls at when it was lost. Marge's legacy also lives on because pictures of Marge with Bong that were taken in mid-March were used all across the United States when he broke Eddie Rickenbacker, the World War I ace's record. And here's a picture of Rickenbacker holding a picture of Bong with Marge. So at this point in April, Marge had already crashed, but because it was the only available images of Bong for the media, Marge had a sort of second life when he exceeded that record. Here's Marge with her mother looking at a picture of Richard with Marge. And you can see the aerial victories and the technical data block there. And Marge holding the newspaper with Bong with the news headline about him breaking the record. And you also notice that she's wearing a P-38 pin, which I think is incredible. Obviously, she was a fan of Richard Bong and the P-38. Finally, and in my last visit to the Bong Center in November, looking through Marge's scrapbooks, I was blown away to discover a political cartoon that appeared in the Daily Mirror, a New York newspaper. And this political cartoon depicts Richard Bong in Marge with a baseball bat whacking a Japanese pilot and the word Bong emitting. And the name of the cartoon was For Whom the Bell Tolls by an artist named Fred Packer. And Fred Packer was one of America's most famous political cartoonists who later earned a Pulitzer Prize for a different cartoon about Truman. But To say that Marge was a famous airplane would be an understatement because it was subject to not only intense interest, but a political cartoon depicting it. And there you can see a cartoon version of Richard Bong leaning out of the cockpit of Marge. So with that, moving on to our expedition in New Guinea, we conducted a site survey and investigation of the crash site. And the primary reason to do this was to locate unique identifiers that would prove that this crashed airplane in New Guinea, although it was at the right location where we expected Marge to be, we needed proof that it was that particular aircraft. Of course, in New Guinea, there were many aircraft lost, American, Japanese, Australian, and this wreckage had to be identified to not only be specifically a P-38, a J model, and then this specific serial number of Marge. Part of that process involved documentation. Every single piece of wreckage that was at the site was meticulously photographed, GPSed, documented in video. Some of the pieces that were on the surface that could be easily and non-invasively disturbed were flipped over and examined for all sides that were visible, but our search did not involve excavation or digging and left the site exactly as we found it. A lot of our findings have been already put online. We did a press conference and also a live event. I invite you to watch those on YouTube. And many of the pictures we're going to look at today are available in the press kit that was released to the media and the world that has many of these same pictures that I invite you to look at yourself and see the same evidence that I'm about to present. So specifically, I've chosen 3 unique identifiers from this crash site that will funnel this from being any airplane in the world to specifically P-38J Marge. And those include a landing gear strut, a radiator with a data plate and part number, and then finally the wingtip that's painted red and has the serial number 993. These are unique identifiers specific to this aircraft. The first is the landing gear strut. And every World War II aircraft was different and unique. And one of the fingerprints of each airplane is the landing gear legs. In order to have a twin-engine airplane, propellers clear the ground, every landing gear leg is an intricate part of the design that allows the plane to operate, take off, and land. And this landing gear, as you can see, although it just looks like a tube covered in moss today, from different angles you can see is definitely appears to be a landing gear leg. And here is a page from the illustrated parts catalog showing that exact piece of the main landing gear strut. And I've annotated there the 3 pieces you can see in the picture. The 2 arms that come out, one is retracted, but you can see they're clearly there and they match in every fitting and every dimension to the parts catalog. Specifically, they were called the main landing gear, the strut assembly, and the terminal assembly. So, of course, with every aircraft, every part has a specific name that was used by the Army and Lockheed. Secondly, we discovered the radiator of the aircraft. And this was a unique discovery because this part had a data plate on it. Here's a picture of that radiator damaged in the crash, but you can see it's a half-moon shaped radiator that was in the boom of the aircraft. And the data plate that's on it is quite unique. I've annotated that data plate there and also where it was on the parts catalog. Looking at that data plate, it's interesting because it does not have the serial number of the airplane, but it does verify the model, and the part number is direct match to what's in the catalog. So I've highlighted here the part number 197325 and the model. It says P38-JK. We'll get to that in a moment. Specifically, this is the radiator assembly, as I said, and you can see that part number 197325 is here in the parts catalog, proving that this part and this data plate is associated with a specific P-38 Lightning, and obviously one that's from the model J or K. The radiator assembly portion here, you can see what's interesting about that data plate is the listing of JK. Of course, the J model was the largest production variant of the P-38 until the P-38L, which exceeded it. But the P-38K is something that puzzled me. I had never heard of it, and it's because it was a model that only one aircraft was ever built. It was an experimental aircraft with paddle propellers that was not developed into a production aircraft. So clearly, when this component was made and when this data plate created, the subcontractor anticipated it being used on P-38Js and P-38Ks, but as the war and history proceeded, the Army decided to only develop the J model. Because this aircraft is not the one P-38K model that existed, that never left the United States, we can eliminate that as a possibility. And again, there you can see the serial number of that 1K and the J models that preceded it. Finally, I'd like to present to you what was the definitive piece of this aircraft. Amazingly, both wingtips were present at the crash site, and they had this brilliant red paint on them. And as you can see, the red paint is partially faded. The lower portion there, you can see the bare aluminum below it. The wingtip is badly damaged from the crash. This airplane impacted trees in the jungle as it broke up and impacted the ground. Also above, you can see a piece of white with a blue tab. That's the edge of the U.S. national insignia, the star and bar insignia that was used at this time. And there at the center, you can see what is actually a formation light, the fitting for it, in the middle of the photograph. So as discussed, Richard Bong's P-38 Marge had red wingtips, red propeller spinners, and immediately I realized that this was a marking associated with Marge, and remarkable that it had survived 80 years to the present. It's kind of beyond belief to think that in the jungle things could be preserved, but because in New Guinea the trees grow around and so tall, hundreds of feet above the floor of the jungle, this artifact, like much of the crash site, is largely protected from UV light, and on a near daily basis is gently flushed with fresh water from rainfall, and ironically is preserved fairly well in this jungle environment. Here's that World War II photo wide view showing what we're looking at there. We're looking at the left wingtip, the upper surface. So unfortunately, this picture doesn't depict exactly that wingtip, but the circle there annotates what is that part of the plane. Here's a painting depicting Marge as aerial victory on February 15th, and you can see those red wingtips. And that is the piece on the lower portion of that painting that is depicted in that piece of wreckage. Parts from the catalog show the complex nature of the outer wing panel there, the wingtip portion, and the pieces of the wing and aileron assembly. The technical term for this is the wingtip, and it's made of several different parts and sub-assemblies. And the light fixture on it is also indicated in the parts catalog. The final piece that was so exciting about this wingtip was the fact that it had a stenciled serial number on it. Now, in addition to the serial number being in large digits on the tail, on that technical data block on the nose, Lockheed put the serial number everywhere on the aircraft as a stencil, a painted number in black on different pieces of the airplane. And you can imagine during the assembly process of this particular aircraft, each part was serialized to keep it together, and the wingtip as it was mounted to the wing and so forth. Serial numbers were everywhere. And we were very lucky that this serial number still remained. And probably it was overpainted by the red paint. And when that paint had faded away, it was revealed beneath it. And you can see in the picture, I'm pointing just towards that stencil. And even from this distance, you can clearly see the first two digits, 99, and then next to it is another digit that, as you'll see in a moment, must be a 3. Here's a close-up view. We were very careful not to touch this important marking, simply to use fresh water to sort of clean the area. And here you can see the stenciled shape of the 99 and the 3. I've enhanced here in black what traces of the paint remain. Superimposing those digits, you can see them there. And with that, I would like to conclude the presentation and take any questions that you may have about this process of identifying Marge, and thank you for listening.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
The actual location of the crash has not been officially announced, has it? Or is it going to be a national park or something that people can hike to eventually, or what's the plan?
Great question. Obviously, the precise location of Marge or any World War II crash is a very important and sacred coordinate. In one way, that exact coordinate is meaningless because you can't access this site without the cooperation of the local people, without their assistance to guide you to the site, and without them allowing you to walk on their land. But unfortunately, there are forces and people in the world who perhaps would go to the site, remove pieces, or tamper with the site. So we're being very careful not to release the precise crash site coordinate. Working with the Bong Center, the National Museum in Papua New Guinea, and other partners like the province of Madang and the landowners who actually are the caretakers of the site, our hope is that the crash site can be preserved and protected, and perhaps people like you could trek and travel to that location. I think the idea of it being preserved as a park is a great idea. Obviously, in another country, Papua New Guinea, they don't have a national park service or state parks the way we do. But the local people there, thanks to our efforts, are now well aware of the historical significance of this site and are aware that it is their responsibility for now to be the caretakers of this important history. And hopefully, one day, Americans, perhaps Bong family members, or other people who are enthralled by this history can trek to this site as we did and see it for themselves.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
You know, you must have had help locating that. I mean, you just can't go to Papua New Guinea and, well, a farmer must have told you, or you must have had some prior information to go right to the site and to get the people there to okay it.
Yes, great question. So yes, of course, we had additional information. The history of this aircraft is what revealed its location. Prior to the expedition, we poured ourselves over wartime reports, archival research to locate all evidence about this crash. And you can't forget that during World War II in 1944, there was no GPS. There was no precise positioning. So the pilot, Malone, when he bailed out of the plane, described the time after his takeoff that his bailout had happened and his approximate location by dead reckoning. But that is hardly a GPS accurate coordinate. As far as we learned, there has been nobody else who has been to this crash site or has identified it prior to our visit. And that's kind of remarkable, but New Guinea is a place where there are hundreds and thousands of plane wrecks in each province, each location of this country. So in many ways, it's just one of many planes. And because this site did not have a fatality associated with it, it actually was much more difficult to research. Since nobody died in the plane crash, there was no missing in action case or body recovery. The plane was much more difficult to research. Luckily, the historical references pointed to a specific location near the north coast of New Guinea. Malone's description of where he bailed out, rivers he navigated, and how long it took him to find friendly forces helped us to narrow to a general area. But in the end, like so much else in life, it came down to boots on the ground, searching, human intelligence, working with the local communities there, and actually having some failures. We believed we were in the right area, but initially were shown a different plane wreck that was actually a Japanese aircraft, a Ki-43 Type 1 fighter, allied codename Oscar. And this airplane was a spectacular wreck. It was in the same area, but it was not the plane we were looking for. And luckily, the community knew of another plane further away, deeper into the mountains, that ended up being Marge. So luckily, a culmination of historical research, boots on the ground investigation allowed us to successfully locate this plane. But as I stressed to the Bong Center, until we got there, we had no idea what we could find. Even if we could find the place where this plane crashed, it was possible that the crash site was covered by landslide or had fallen down a hill due to erosion, had been removed for scrap metal. All of the natural and man-made impacts that could have impacted this plane for over 80 years were unknowns until we were there. And amazingly, as you saw, the crash site, although it's a badly broken airplane, is largely complete, filling a hillside covered with jungle to this day, much the way it was left in 1944.
Two questions. One is, it was great coincidence that the major had the red markings that helped in 80 years later, you identifying it. Do we know why was there a significance of his red markings? And the other part, the other thing I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about the terrain itself, how challenging that terrain might have been.
Great questions. Regarding the red wingtip, we know very simply that Bong chose the color red simply because he liked red. There was no significance to it. It was not a squadron marking. In Bong's second tour of duty, when Marge was assigned to him, he was part of 5th Fighter Command. He was not flying with a specific squadron like he had in his first tour of duty with the 9th Fighter Squadron. And, you know, pilots have their own prerogatives. And I guess Richard Bong's favorite color was red, or he thought it looked cool. And that was what he adorned his aircraft with. There's a great quote in one of the letters that he wrote home to his family, his mom, that's in Carl Bong's book, when he talks about being assigned this P-38 and says something to the effect of, I'm so excited to have my first airplane to adorn. Previously, I never had a plane long enough before it was damaged or shot down. So this was also significant that Bong clearly intended to make Marge his personal mount, give it his personalized markings and nickname, and put his girlfriend's picture on the nose. He intended to fly it for his entire second tour of duty until it was lost. I should add that when Malone bailed out, he suffered mechanical issues, electrical failures, and the plane went into a spin that he was unable to control and eventually decided he had to bail out. When Richard spoke with him about this incident, although he was initially angry that his beloved Marge was lost, he admitted to Malone that he had also experienced some mechanical issues, electrical issues on previous flights. So possibly Marge had some issues with its airframe that would have resulted in its loss on some mission. And luckily, on March 24th, it was a non-fatal crash. The J model had corrected previous electrical issues that had plagued the P-38, but it was one of the first J-15s built, and possibly had nuances to it that were not yet worked out. And like every aircraft, they're such complicated machines. Any small problem could become detrimental to the aircraft. Regarding the terrain, the crash site is under triple canopy jungle in sort of rolling terrain. It encompasses the size of roughly an American football field at an angle covered with trees. So it is not particularly easy to walk around and navigate, but our team was able to spend a considerable amount of time there documenting what remains. We do believe that more of the aircraft is buried in the ground, both from the initial impact as well as 80 years of erosion. One of the features that I found quite interesting is both of the engines are at the crash site, buried in the ground, and only the tips of the propellers, the 3 propeller tips, are sticking out of the ground, several inches of them. So clearly the plane, when it impacted, was at a downward angle, and the engines, with the highest mass, buried themselves deep into this hillside, leaving only the tips of the propeller stuck out. That amount of force and violence of the crash is hard to imagine, but you can see why pieces that have that sort of accordioned shape to them is where they either impacted trees while crashing and were just utterly and instantly damaged in the violence of that crash. The plane was lost early in its mission. It would have had nearly a full fuel tanks, but amazingly, very little evidence of fire at the crash site. And that's further evidence that the plane broke up as it was crashing, and the pieces that hit the ground were not burned, or there was not a large fire at the site.
Justin, this is Debbie. I am now given permission to tell you what we got in the other day. So Jerry's daughter Nancy came in with things she found in Jerry's bank box. We have an early logbook of Dick's. We have more military papers, with his promotions and that kind of thing. And there's an investigation, several pages of an investigation that he actually should have been credited with 2 more planes. And what I thought was so exciting until I found out it wasn't the same pilot that had this plane, but this Davis, Captain Davis, flew one of Bong's planes, and the list is and it crashed. The list of the things are what he lost from the plane. I keep, oh, look what we got, Well, it's not the same pilot, but it was pretty cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Thank you, Debbie. And I look forward, like many historians, to reviewing that new material. It sounds incredible. Bong's logbook is something that really intrigues me. And what you are talking about is his logbook that covers his early flight training in the United States and first tour of duty. One of the mysteries about Richard Bong is, where is his logbook for his second and third tour of duties? Did they get lost? Does the family have them? Are they in another safe deposit box somewhere? We don't know. And finding the original logbook for his second and third tour of duty would be incredible. Luckily, we have that data in his Army flight logs, his Form 5s, and judging from the way he recorded flights in his first logbook, Bong did not list the serial numbers, meaning we can speculate the missions that he flew with Marge, but only the missions where he achieved combat victories, where there additional forms that have the serial number are those listed. But that is really exciting. I look forward to reviewing all that. And regarding aerial victories, Debbie, I should add that in our research after the search, we have verified the 3 victories that Bong made in Marge. Amazingly, each of those victories is documented in Japanese records, action reports, intercepts, unit histories that confirm not only a plane was shot down at the same time, at the same location, but even who the Japanese pilots were that Bong shot down on those 3 occasions. I'm not aware of that research ever being done before or published, and look forward to sharing it with you. Obviously, air combat happened in a blink of an eye, but in the cockpit of the opposing airplane was another human being who now has a name and a story that we can share. I see a question there from Annabelle. No remote sensing search in the Marge case. In this case, no. Remote sensing was not utilized because we did not know where to look. Obviously, you could utilize sensing tools or Google Earth imagery to search for and look in the general location we believe the site to be, but because most of the area is covered with thick jungle and rolling terrain, seeing anything in visual Google Earth imagery was impossible. Potentially, the crash site could be visible through remote sensing. It is metal on a hillside, but as you saw, the challenge would be, could a aircraft that is now dozens of pieces, no more than a meter or 2 in size, be detected? And of course, technology and tools are amazing things. I hope the answer is yes, but this crash site in remote sensing would probably look like a pixel, an array of pixels in a football field area, not the shape of an aircraft with wings and a tail to be detected. In addition, pieces of the airplane are covered by soil, are covered by vegetation, and are partially at angles on this hillside. So it makes the challenge of using technology to find a site like this quite difficult. Of course, with the development of technology, perhaps there will be a tool today or in the future that can see this crash site, but even utilizing a drone above the crash site area, all you can see visually is triple canopy jungle. This site is not visible from the air, and that's largely what has protected it and the pieces and the original paint that you saw. Thank you. I see another question here from Steve Kleiman. Do you prefer operating as a team or easier conducting expedition solo? And I should add, Steve Kleiman was also on the Marge search. He was part of the team at the crash site. So he was part of that team. So of course, to answer your question, Steve, going to a crash site with a team is always more ideal and more conducive to the best site survey. With more team members, the tasks at hand of searching documentation can be divided, can be shared. And amazingly, at site, we had 3 primary team members, myself, Steve, and photographer Joel. All 3 of us recorded different images, different video, and saw different things that collectively were remarkable to quickly document and explore this site. Steve personally was probably the first to see that Radiator data plate that we looked at. It was him in the picture with his phone taking of the first images of it. He drew it to my attention. So Steve, without your help on that site, perhaps that Radiator data plate would have been missed, and you were the first one to see it. Going to sites solo is also something that I've done through both necessity and breaking off from larger teams. And the challenge of going to any site individually is the greatest enemy is time. Any time you go to one of these remote crash sites, it usually involves an incredible effort, trekking, hiking, sometimes fording streams or wading through swamps just to get to the site that you hope to see. And often when you finally get there, there's a very narrow time frame of hours, minutes that are available to actually conduct the work. In a perfect world, one would have unlimited time and unlimited resources to spend at a crash site like Marge. In reality, from the moment the sun is up till the moment the sun sets is really the only effective time you can work in a place in New Guinea, and every second, every minute counts. And Steve was also saw that in action at both Marge and other sites where he was the timekeeper, I guess you could say, saying, "Okay, time to eat lunch," or time to wrap it up. So that's another important task that a team versus individual requires. So great question. Thank you.
I've got a question. How many projects are on your wait list, or how do you determine the top priority?
That's a great question. After 30 years, Pacific Rex is in a unique position. We have more projects than we can do. We have more projects than our funding allows us to accomplish. And even with an angel donor who dropped in unlimited resources, this is a task and a mission that is never ending and quite expansive. The US government, for instance, has been searching since World War II for missing aircraft and missing in action cases, has millions of dollars of budgets, and only gets to Papua New Guinea once a year approximately. So at that rate, and at the rate that the US government identifies are missing about 200 a year, it will take more than all of our lifetimes for the findable MIAs to be located and identified. So that's a humbling sort of reality, but like with every problem in life, we attack projects based on feasibility, also logistics and what can be accomplished on what is often a shoestring budget. We generally walk to sites or use local transportation like boats and so forth to get to the nearest land location to walk into these sites. It's time consuming. It's just as expensive as flying in many cases, but it is a way that allows us to also collect human intelligence from the communities, earn their trust, and often see additional sites that weren't known to us in our research. That Japanese plane that I mentioned on the way to the Bong crash site was a plane that I had never heard of. Wasn't even aware of, and yet it was there. So it always amazes me that the greatest tool for finding aircraft is the people who live in those areas, their expertise, their knowledge. Although they don't know what particular airplane it is or who the pilot was specifically, they often have oral histories and information about these sites that exist nowhere else. For instance, amazingly, with the Bong crash site, although they did not know of its association with Richard Bong or the nickname Marge, the community had a story from their forefathers about the pilot who bailed out. And they showed us where they rescued him and where they first saw him and how moments that they remembered from his escape and evasion. So although they did not know that pilot's name, they were telling the story of the pilot from the plane from their perspective. And that's a story that is only in the community and available there. So quite remarkable, and because of that, we were able to visit the locations associated with Malone, where he bailed out, what river he crossed, and so forth, and bring that story to life as well. We have a few minutes left. If there's no other questions, I would like to indulge you in another quick sort of mini presentation in the last minutes. I will share my screen. And we discussed this key piece of identification, the stencil. And to culminate everything we've talked about today, the process of identification, I would like to hypothetically present the 993 in a different terms, which is historically. If you look at the stencil and say, boy, I don't see that, how does this guy think it could be 993? Yeah, I see a first digit that looks like a 9. I guess the second one is, but what's that third digit? What could it be? What if it's not a 3? And although we are very confident of this, there's another tool that can be used to validate this being a 993. And this line of research, we took the aircraft status cards for every plane 990, 991, 992, 3, etc., all the way out to 999. In other words, the 10 possibilities that could fit 99 something. And I'd like to share those results with you now. And as you'll see through the process of historical elimination, we can prove that this digit is a 3 and this serial number is 993. So this is a list, a table showing the 10 aircraft 990 through 999. I've highlighted there in the middle 993, which is Marge. Each of these aircraft, according to their status cards, had an assignment and a fate, which was how they were, their life ended. And you can see there some of them are scrapped, others are condemned due to accidents, and some have notes about how they were lost and so forth. So the first discriminator in this list is to eliminate 999. Why? That aircraft never left the United States. It was held for experimental use at Wright Field in Ohio, never left the United States, and was scrapped. Therefore, a plane wreck that you found in New Guinea must be 990 through 998. And I've added the 5th Air Force logo there to indicate that all of these airplanes were initially assigned to the 5th Air Force in Australia or New Guinea. Next, we can eliminate the 3 crashes, the 3 planes that are lost at specific known locations. Several of these planes were destroyed, one in an air raid, one in a flight test accident in Townsville, Australia, and another crashed at Nadzab Airfield. So those 3 planes that were lost at specific locations can also be eliminated because they're not where we were at the crash site. And as you can see, our list is now reduced. And the next set of planes that can be removed are the ones that are scrapped. That means that the aircraft was not lost in combat, not lost in accident. At the end of its life, it was condemned to salvage, most likely in New Guinea, and was broken up for scrap. And that leaves us with 3 aircraft. And 2 of those planes, one is condemned in accident, non-combat, just like Marge, 990, and another 997 is condemned in an accident. We don't know the precise fate and location of those incidents, but generally, condemned accident is used for a plane that had a ground accident, taxiing, or some minor mishap at an airfield, and likely can be eliminated. The other aircraft, the condemned accident non-combat, also, again, we don't know the specific location, but it is highly likely that it's eliminated. So as you can see here, really only 3 of those numbers, 990, 993, which it is, and 997 are even possibilities. And looking back at that stencil, you can clearly see the last digit is very unlikely to be 997 or 990, meaning through the process of historical elimination that 993 must be and is the serial number of this plane. And again, if you don't believe me, here's our source data for each of those aircraft, 990, 1, 2, 3. This is Marge, showing each of their fates and where we gained that data for the table. So this is an exciting line of historical inquiry to use historical analysis as another tool to help identify a crash site. And I should add that other entities like the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency that searches for MI airplanes uses these same sort of historical tools to identify aircraft. And you can see here that this is the remaining data, leaving us with the last one, 999, that never left Wright Field. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this presentation about identifying Marge. I think we've stayed right on time, just like a good combat mission. If there's any final questions, I'd love to hear them. And again, I thank everybody for attending, those there in the Bong Center and those tuning in worldwide. Thank you.
Any last questions before he logs out?
Actually, I do have one question, sorry.
I was one in the back.
You had said that you ran into a Japanese aircraft on the way. When you run into non-target specimens, so to speak, do you survey them at all and hand that off to, say, the Japanese government in this case, or?
Absolutely. Yes. Pacific Rec's mission is to document everything that remains. Aircraft, ships, battlefields, bomb craters, unexploded ordnance. And that particular Japanese plane, yes, was surveyed to virtually the same level as Marge, as we discussed today. According to the locals, the pilot of the plane actually survived the crash landing. The plane had the wheels retracted and it probably force landed, and according to them, walked away. His fate beyond that is unknown. Did he rejoin friendly forces? Did he die of exposure? We don't know. But that information implies that the site was non-fatal, meaning there was no remains at the crash site. We did not observe any, nor had they ever mentioned finding human remains with that aircraft. But that site is now known and documented and part of a ever-developing sort of geographical database of points on the map that have war wreckage and remains of war. Potentially Japanese people might like to see that plane wreck as well as Americans. It's quite spectacular as well. And for me, every plane wreck is important. And that Oscar may have even been one that was in combat or damaged and caused to force land by the 5th Air Force or P-38 Lightnings. We'll never know, but it is now a known site that is part of our documentation and perhaps will one day reveal more secrets. Japanese airplanes also had serial numbers called manufacturer numbers that were stenciled on their aircraft. The Oscar had 3 or 4-digit number. We were not able to locate it on that specific plane, but based on identifiers on the aircraft, the engine, the propeller, we could tell that it was a Oscar Model 2 with a 3-bladed propeller, which was a type of airplane used in New Guinea during 1943-44. And beyond that, the rest of its history is unknown, and it, like so many, is a ghost in the Pacific today.
Can I ask one last question?
Go ahead. Yep, absolutely.
I've done a lot of reading in Papua New Guinea. My son and his wife are missionary support. I have my grandson here who graduated from high school, international school. In my readings, when there were plane crashes, it seemed like there were locals, and most of the people, supported the Allies. And it seemed like there was locals that or scouts, that I think they might have been led by Aussies or New Zealanders, that seemed to appear out of nowhere to try to rescue because the enemy was pretty close. Have you much background in that, or?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you for the question, and great to hear of your family connections to New Guinea. There are many American missionaries that live and work in New Guinea today, and the area where the Marge crash site is largely Lutheran because of missionary activities pre-war. As you mentioned, the people in New Guinea were, depending on the area where they were, either loyal to the Allies or the Japanese. In the Japanese occupied areas, the people, through sort of the reality of war, realized they had to cooperate with the Japanese, otherwise they would face terrible repercussions and retribution. So Allied pilots that went down in Japanese areas were often, the people would turn them over to the Japanese, fearing their own lives and communities, even if they're at their heart were afraid of doing so. Many pilots who were injured also were turned over to the nearest authorities in hopes that they could get medical attention. But yes, nearly every crash site in New Guinea, when you go to that area and meet the people, you realize that they have a whole layer of history that hasn't been encapsulated in records or documentation. People live and walk all over New Guinea, and if they didn't see a plane crashing during the war, their communities, the men who hunt, the women who garden, often are the first to discover plane wrecks that crashed. So the people of New Guinea are very important and instrumental in the process of finding, identifying crash sites, and often, as I've shared with the Marge story, have information that appears nowhere else. A final point, something that hasn't been asked, but I'd like to address it. The Marge crash site, we saw some of the diagnostic pieces that remain, and the sort of obvious question is, where's the picture of Marge? Where's the nickname on the side of the nose? And in short, we did not see that in our visit. Is potentially part of that left gun cover that has traces of the red and white outlined cursive Marge at that crash site? Perhaps, maybe, but not in any of the wreckage that we saw and investigated. Does piece of the Marge portrait remain at the crash site? I don't know. I'd like to hope and think so, but knowing that it was a photograph that was adhered with glue to that panel and the passage of 80 years, it seems very unlikely. Photograph was of course printed on photographic paper. The image was created through chemicals that after 80 years, you can imagine that that photo paper, even if preserved underneath layers of glue, would likely have faded and deteriorated. Bacteria, insects, and the process of 80 years of rainfall, heat, and humidity likely have destroyed any trace of the picture. But I like to dream and believe, and perhaps with further investigation, maybe a piece of that artwork could be found and located. If it was there, I think it would be a tiny fragment that happened to be preserved, buried in the ground, or bent inside the panel as it was crashed. But there was no evidence, unfortunately, of the nickname or nose art of Marge. But those are the realities of the natural impacts that likely destroyed it after the crash. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody. Visit Pacific Recs, email me at justin@pacificrecs.org. And hopefully I will see you all again in Superior in the future. And stay tuned as the story of Marge will continue to evolve with new research and hopefully future visits and explorations. Thank you.